Hi again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part two of our conversation on Kwaito bodies, remastering space and subjectivity in post-apartheid South Africa. My name is Tayo Jalausho. I am joined by Vusi Nkomo and the author of Kwaito Bodies, Xavier Liverman. We continue our conversation by discussing Afro-diasporic solidarity. Vusi, can you talk about the idea of Afro-diasporic solidarity and, from a South African standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
This idea of solidarity makes us feel comfortable, right? Who are not South African. We can just be like, yeah, we all Black. We share that. We good. But is there still more about this outsiderness that needs to be affirmed, as as distinct, right? Do you get what I'm saying? Do you feel me?
Yeah. I mean, I'd be lying if I said there weren't.
Yeah, please.
There truly is. I mean, when I think firstly, Black culture production, right, in relation to the Afro-diasporic discourse. Firstly, I think of it as, as us trying to connect, in a world where our cultural productions are robbed of universality, because we produce that work as people also robbed of community, right, and humanity in general. As Louis Gordon speaks, that, we produce things that are immediately questioned as we produce them. But that's just an external look towards, also sort of an externally imposed logic on us, right? But there are, sort of horizontal contradictions, if I may use Frank Wilderson's theorization or argument, sort of horizontal ways in which we relate to one another. And in quite problematic ways, how, for instance, Xavier, for instance, would be, accepted in the country are not the same as you, Tayo, from someone of Nigerian background. We are aware of, Afrophobic sentiments throughout the country that are quite serious, serious implications for people's lives. Which has also been a thing, quite heightened way even during COVID-19 pandemic, with the first, people who were quite, physically violated sometimes, at times denied access to healthcare, denied access to various states, services from Zimbabwe, from various other African states. And that how it also just plays itself out in various other parts, right? It plays itself out in the arts, it plays itself out, in us as we engage in community building. So it becomes quite important then to have, this sort of Afro-diasporic interventions, right? That try to foster not only, commonalities, right, but rather try to foster the ways in which, we inherit certain continuities, right? And I think the book tries to zoom into, sort of cultural and aesthetic continuities between, for instance, Kwaito and House, which is a product of the Black queer space in North America, and the US to be specific, and how those continuities, or rather convergence between the two forms of, cultural production, are quite, symbolic of the ways in which we've been trying to foster, intercontinental solidarity amongst all Black communities, and I think there's a need for that, and I think there's an urgency to it, and it's not only limited to culture and the arts and the aesthetic. Like I said, there's implications for Zimbabweans getting access to healthcare in this country. There's implications to Nigerians, registering and being in universities, right? And studying businesses and, that sort of thing. So I think it's important then that we think about these things in and beyond, the arts and the culture. I don't know if that's sufficient enough for you, Tanya.
No, thank you. It relates it to, the contemporary crisis as well. where like, I guess, shared blackness as our fates are entangled no matter where you are.
True. True.
But you had questions, and I didn't mean to keep you from getting to them, Vusi.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wanted to get a further comment around the use of the phrase remastery.
Oh yeah.
And just to get you speak a bit around there was a thing that I picked up as maybe this would be too harsh, but as a sort of not optimism, right? But rather, you speak of how Kwaito allows us to sort of an attempt to reconfigure, the slave-master relations, right? As a form of remastery, and I don't know if I would think in those quite positive ways as you've been able to, But you had made those lips, and I was interested in your reason to think in that way. And maybe I guess I'm accusing you of
of being over idealistic.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Can I also jump in on that too? I'm curious about remastery. Like, yes, I definitely get the possibilities of remastering, right, from the space of sonic production, right? But so in a way, it's kind of like you remaster to adhere to the original, right? Whereas remixing is, pushing the original into spaces of possibility, right? And so, I'm curious about remastery as the choice here as well.
Yeah, no, thanks. So it started off with my colleague Lyndon Gill, actually, and we were kind of just sitting around. I was trying to think about a framework that would mean kind of like, okay, something new is happening here, right? But it's based on something that preceded it, right? And I think literally, I remember Lyndon being like, every music book has the word remixing in it. It's just kind of like, can you come up with something different, right? Like, I mean, literally, that's what he said to me. And I said, yeah, I don't know. And he said, well, what about a remastering? It kind of, and I thought about it and I said, this is interesting. Let me run with this and see where it takes me, right? And so a couple of things, and I think I said this in certain interviews or discussions I've said about the book. I'm not sure I would adhere to that now. Like, I don't know if I would, use that framework in the same way, right? But, I arrived at it because I wanted something that wasn't just this total reconfiguration, which I feel like in some ways a remix is, right? I wanted something that was hopeful and optimistic, because in my sense, when I was thinking about how the 90s were being approached, a lot of people were kind of like, if we as Black people take over the government of this country, it resolves the problem of apartheid. Now, I'm not suggesting by any means that was the entire scape, right, of the country. Clearly, there were Black leftists, and folks, much more radical in the political spectrum who were sounding the alarm, right? In the sense of like what the post-apartheid government could mean if it kind of, continued on the path that it seemed like it was taking, this sort of more liberal/neoliberal approach, right, to the government. So I don't want to dismiss the political work of those folks, right? But I will say that, like, my sense was that folks who were engaging in Kwaito, I think in many ways, but at least that early stuff was like, we're here, we're going to do this, and by us being here, it's going to make some kind of really important and significant change. And so I think that, and to that extent, I think that a lot of people did buy into this idea that that the society that was the apartheid society, at least as far as its socio-political and socio-economic formation, right, could be transformed by the incorporation of Blacks into that space, right, and the incorporation of Black South Africans into that space. And so I think there was a certain kind of optimism that those relationships would change, right, by virtue of changing who was engaging in those relations, right? And I think that, you know, if you look at a lot of the interview, I mean, I didn't include the interview data, but, you know, if you look at a lot of the interviews with Kwaito artists in the 90s, they weren't saying like, you know, they weren't critiquing neoliberalism per se, or the, you know, or, you know, certain kinds of problems of socioeconomic relations. They felt like we're here, we now have equal opportunity, and we're going to take advantage of that, right? And so for me, I think remastery was the way that people approached it. They saw this thing that had already existed, and they wanted to clean it up. Right, they wanted to clean it up. They wanted to remove the imperfections. Right, they wanted to make it something better, right? And I think that I mean, I'm sure there's a percentage of people who were cynical about this, but I think that both the political rulership class and everyday people, I think, genuinely believed, right, that this thing could be transformed, right? You know, that you could inherit that BMW, right? And I'm just using this as and that by the fact that Black people were now in the BMW where they had not been in it before, perhaps we could even argue they were driving it, right? Would change would change what that meant, right? And I think that that was the optimism of that time period. I think that was the optimism of Black youth in that time period. And so my idea was not so much to communicate Pollyanna-ish or kind of impossibly optimistic frameworks. It was more to say that I think that people did genuinely and sincerely believe that this would lead to a certain kind of transformation that would benefit the society. And I think that and it was me trying to grapple with, you know, this thing in post-colonial studies, right, of like the post-colonial having to include the colonial and deal with it in a particular kind of way. Like the post-colonial doesn't just mean colonization is over, right? It means that you're dealing with the afterlives of that. And I felt that remastery allowed me to do that, allowed me to talk about the afterlives of apartheid and how young Black people were trying to confront and deal with that. I think now young Black people have perhaps a slightly different approach, right, to what we would call the afterlives of apartheid. But I think in 1990s, it was, you know, and even the early to mid aughts, I mean, I think that first 20 years, so to speak, right, I just feel that, you know, there was this desire to work within that system and think that Black people, and particularly young Black people's entering into that system would be transformative. And I think if I were to change that slightly, like if I were to keep with there's work from Saidiya Hartman that I feel like was missing in my conceptualization of remastery that I would probably include in a kind of future iteration of the conversation that wasn't there. And I also wanted to get at the multiple meanings of remastery, right? So this attempt to kind of engage colonial relations, master-slave hierarchies, but also this idea of producing something new that couldn't entirely escape that which came before it. And that was my, but I'm going to be honest with you, it really started off initially as remixing in my head, right? And then being told by someone I love and see as a major intellectual interlocutor, my colleague Lyndon, that like every music book is remixing, like do something different, imagine something different, do something different with language and metaphor than remixing. And I thought, and then I started thinking, is it really even a remix that's happening? And so that really made me move to remastery. I've been asked why not decoloniality, and I think I would respond in the same way. I think that a lot of people felt that state recognition and state incorporation was the decolonial move at that time, right? And I think not really anticipating just how the residues of apartheid and the afterlives of apartheid would continue to live on in a particular kind of way. And to some extent, I think the debate around Mofakate's art, Kafir was the beginning of some of that conversation in some ways, right? Because it's like, do we just not say this word and that mean it goes away? Right. And I think that was some of the tension, right? That was inherent in this immediate period that still, of course, is important and imperative now, even if I think people have different approaches. So I hope that kind of gets at, what I was trying to do, because I think I was trying to speak to some of the imaginations for what could possibly be freedom within that, but also some of the real limitations, and in a way that I think felt to me, I don't know if I want to use the word true, but that felt accurate or representative of both what was happening from a sonic production standpoint, or a cultural formation standpoint, as well as a socio-political standpoint. But I am prepared to that, people are going to be like, I'm prepared that people will be uncomfortable with that. I'm prepared that some people will say that maybe I'm not criticizing that enough. I think my idea was to try to offer it up as a nuanced way to think about how people were kind of negotiating the in-between of like a resistance kind of cooptation binary. So that's why I kind of framed it that way. But it's not, it is something that I'd be very open to being challenged and rethinking. And as I said, I'm not sure I would even approach it in exactly the same way if I were to rewrite the book at this very moment.
I mean, it's so interesting to think about remastery in the context of Audre Lorde, with whom you also engage, right? I don't think Audre would would go with remastery, right? Because she wants us to come out of the master's house altogether, right? As opposed to actually adopting, as much as we can clean it up or whatever, it's still a system. It's still, the master's tool that we have to live away from that structure, right? In order to access the space of freedom.
Yeah. And I think that there was a passage there where I kind of engaged that a little bit more explicitly in the conclusion, and it kind of ended up falling out in the last couple of versions of the revision.
Yeah, so I think I've actually run out of time.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So
okay.
let's wrap it up. Let me just tell you my questions, and then we can just do a quick wrap up. My question really had to do with the economics of this, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of who consumes. Like, if we're to celebrate consumption as a space of freedom, and consumption as a space of pleasure, which is valid for freedom, right? Who can afford to consume? And it goes back to this idea that I do not accept 1994 as the end of apartheid. In fact, I still think of post-apartheid as an aspiration rather than a present, experience, right? Um, and so it seems that at different layers or levels of society, there are different experiences ushering forth, right? So while you were writing and experiencing and theorizing Kwaito, right, I was living and working with activists who are, critiquing South Africa's neoliberal dispensation, and not just like critiquing it from an external positionality, but from the point of everyday life, from like contestations with police, right? Violent encounters with police as they're trying to defend their homes, right? Being evicted from land that they've claimed, land that they've reclaimed as a space of their freedom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So it does, like the economic aspect of it really needs to be teased out, and also so does freedom. Why must Kwaito be anchored to freedom? And and I would also say that freedom, means something different based on what you're currently grappling with as a question of survival.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you.
Vusi, any last words?
I'm really interested in the hear what's here, but if you wanna answer, Xavier?
No, I don't. I think you need to go, so I don't want to. I feel like I'll keep you too long. So I'd just love to hear what your questions are. If you'd like to share any kind of final questions, and these are things that I can then think about, and we can always reconvene and have further conversation about these things.
I like Teo's question around the critique of the neoliberal paradigm, because it was also linked to some of the things that I wanted to ask you about, or in relation to what you think of as the historical processes that are prior and during the emergence of Kwaito, and the argument around the end of apartheid was less likely, was less related to the emergence of Kwaito compared to the victory of the global paradigm, or the victory or the triumph over Cold War, right? Mm-hmm. Which basically it got me thinking around about the historical processes, right? And the political developments in and outside of the country, and how Kwaito was founded outside of that, right? And then how Kwaito emerges, you say it also emerges as a critique of globalization, right? Mm-hmm. While at the same time it is a product of that same globalization, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think in relation to what Theo is bringing, I guess I'm also interested, right, in you thinking about Kwaito as a form of expressing what you call, or rather what you phrase as performing new freedoms, mm-hmm. Right? And how do you think of that, and the sort of consumerist component of the same, mm-hmm. The same culture, but also phrasing it as a way in which young people are performing new freedoms, right? And how does that relate to the critique of neoliberalism in the country, as Theo is phrased it perfectly. And what was your thinking around that, right? So I was also interested in that conversation. I think we're actually asking the same question, but you rather phrase it way better than me. But yeah. Hence I was like, I'm really interested in your response to it. I don't know, maybe you'd want to.
Yeah, well,
I do have a couple of minutes.
Okay. I can begin, and then I do want to give y'all a opportunity to kind of just kind of promote or pub any of your your things that you're doing.
So I wanted to ask Theo, in my sort of biting from you, did I in any way misrepresent what you said?
No, you're good.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I will say is that I do think that there were two things that were going on in my research that I wanted to kind of speak about. So yes, I mean, I think on the one hand, I tried to think about, what are some of the larger movements that would have made Kwaito possible, right? And I think I wanted to, and this was building a bit off of Gavin Steingo's work, but I wanted to kind of de-link this kind of idea that this sort of just emerges with the change in government, right? In 94, but rather there were a number of different things happening socioeconomically in the country before 94 that kind of allowed Kwaito to emerge, right? And I think part of that was also for me to do a criticism of neoliberalism that pushes prior to 94, because I feel like so much of the thing is like, the ANC adopted neoliberalism, right? And what I was trying to show or to think about was how that was actually very much adopted as part of the late apartheid regime, right? And how that kind of set the stage for what the ANC could inherit and how it could inherit, right? Certain kinds of governmental and societal social functions. And so, the two things that I'll just say about, I definitely think that for me, I think that I linked it with freedom because that was, and I don't want to be, I don't want to make it seem as if I don't interrogate my ethnography, right? But that was oftentimes how it was described by both the artist and the fans, right? As a kind of freedom, or certain kind of freedom, or a way to. So that was the linkage for me, was to kind of take that seriously. If people were saying that, particularly often because much of the commentary about the cultural formation was to suggest there was anything but that, right? So I wanted to kind of deal with that contradiction between the framing, from a kind of socioeconomic standpoint and how people themselves were describing it. And then I think the last thing that I'll just say is that it was one of the reasons why I tried to spend quite a bit of time thinking about how people could engage in consumption despite limited resources, right? And that was important to them in particular kinds of ways. So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that and deal with that, because I did feel that, and I wanted to I think offer something beyond the framework that I felt like seemed to dismiss the cultural formation entirely, because of its kind of performance of consumption, right? And materialism and bling, right? And that these are all things that are just horrible, and we're not to take, the music, the culture, and the people who engage it seriously as a result, right? And I wanted to kind of say, okay, like there are very real critiques there, and I want to acknowledge those critiques, but I also want to suggest that there's maybe something slightly more nuanced happening in these spaces without hopefully celebrate. Like the idea wasn't to celebrate it, right? It's like, yay, this is a wonderful thing. It was more to just say, I think that there's something more complicated and nuanced happening there, right? And I think I can also, acknowledge that. I try to talk a lot about the fact that when I'm in these spaces, sometimes someone's there and that's their one time a month to be in that space, and they're there. Frankly, someone else is buying the liquor, someone else is buying the booze. They're wearing clothes that they've literally pieced together from a sister here and a cousin here and a neighbor there, and their mother who could sew, right? And give them it's a lot of, and I wanted to just kind of talk about that, right? And know that maybe the other, 3 weeks of the year, they're doing something else, or they're not able to even engage that at all, right? But that one weekend, month end, or whatever, right? They're there in the scene and they're doing their thing. And so I wanted to just be able to, I think, to talk about that in a way that wasn't so derisive and dismissive, while hopefully not making some kind of or not making a gesture that made it seem as if I was, I don't know, kind of celebrating that kind of engagement with consumption. And I think the other thing that really grated me a lot with the ways that young Black folks' relation to consumption was being discussed was that it felt to me that, consumption is celebrated everywhere in South Africa except when the young Black people from townships do it. And I just kind of wanted to be like, well, what is going on here, right? I mean, there's such a disproportionate, in my opinion, given the actual economy of South Africa, right? There are more, particularly in the early aughts. I mean, maybe now the U.S. is kind of caught up and past, South Africa in that sense. But when I was first getting there in the 90s and aughts, I was like, how many lifestyle shows of rich people in rich houses with their rich cars can this country have? Right? Like, I mean, it was just, I just was like I hadn't seen anything like that since like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous in the 80s US context, right? As I said, I think that the U.S. is kind of caught up now and past it, but, being in South Africa in the late 90s, especially understanding what the larger macroeconomic situation was, it was so bizarre to me to see like top billing and blah, blah. And, that was like, there were like 10 of those shows out at the time, right? And so it just, I remember thinking about the inordinate number of lifestyle magazines. Like you would walk into, the drugstore and there'd be like 60 of these magazines. I was like, there were more of them than in the US, and I thought to myself, okay, so my sense was that, I don't know, I wanted to think about like, what does it mean for young people perceived as poor, or under-resourced, right? To be the butt of all of our critique of both capitalism and consumption, right? Because it is not critiqued, when it's the Oppenheimers or the Ramaphosa's or unless it can be linked specifically to, quote unquote government waste or corruption, right? Like, so, a lot of Zuma's, consumption was critiqued for that reason, right? But if there's this sense that maybe I should say the Motsepes instead, right? But, there's a ton of celebration of this. And so it just seemed, it seemed like for young Black people who were engaging in these consumptive practices, they were getting it from all sides. So, it was white, liberal, progressive, and leftist people who were just shitting on them, and Black people as well, right? And I just kind of thought there's got to be something like, why does a Black person consuming certain things make people so angry? Or make people, feel so threatened. And it reminded me of similar kinds of conversations in diasporic spaces in the U.S. around, buying of Nikes or, this idea that that Black people who are working class and poor should not have access to certain kinds of consumptive practices, right? And so I think that was what the reading was about. One of the criticisms of the book that I personally would say is that, and I would maybe do this again if I could, do this differently, if I could do the ethnography again, was that I didn't give people the sense of what folks' lives were outside the party scene, right? I didn't, not like fully enough, right? Like I feel like you don't get a lot of sense of like when they're not interacting with the cultural formation, where do they work? Where do they, do they work? Do they some of these kind of larger socioeconomic positionings weren't there in the manuscript. And they weren't really there in my ethnography in particular ways. And I could have done more with that, I acknowledge. So I think that I think that that's what I would say about economics. So I know you need to go, Vusi. So I'm thinking,
I'm sorry.
If we could, and I hope that that at least begins to kind of answer some of your questions, Tayo and Vusi. But I will just say maybe we can just wrap up and folks can take an opportunity to kind of pub their work or what they're working on. So, Tayo, did you want to begin with final comment?
I'm just really happy that we came together, and it's remarkable to be able to talk about your work. Thank you for giving us the opportunity and thank you for being so gracious in the dialogue. I think this is a remarkable ethnography.
Vusi?
I mean, I love how the book is adding so much value to my practice and other creative projects that I'm currently working on. So I'm working with an American comrade of mine who's living beside, Black American, Kim Reynolds, and another woman, queer comrade of mine called Danny, working on a project called Blackness and Dance. So we did the first with A11 Radio, but I can send you.
Yes, please,
the
please,
links.
please.
Yeah. So we've published the first issue, first episode last week, Saturday, which was trying to explore these continuities within the diaspora, right? So Kim is from Illinois, I think. But she also has Jamaican ancestry. Right, and then Danny is Kenyan born, but grew up in South Africa, right? And so I've always lived here my whole life. So we're just trying to find ways to communicate those things sonically, right? In thinking about how Blackness relates, and how we can. I personally, thinking of of my relationship with that discourse through Kwaito, right? So we're trying to explore it through music, trying to explore with other forms of creative production. So going forward, I'm really interested in how, there's been an addition to, the sort of pool of work we can look to, because there isn't really much, honestly, specifically on Kwaito, So we have Peterson, now review, so we're really, really grateful for, this contributions to the culture. And even though all, I think all of them are so open to critique, right? That's quite important. Even the project that we're doing is also open to critique, So, but going forward, then it would be a thing that I'd be interested in how we could sort of maintain lines of communication and thinking together, throwing back and forth ideas, and that would be amazing. Yeah.
No, I'm definitely down with that. So we
and you too, Tayo, and you too.
Yeah, absolutely.
We should definitely stay in touch. And so, Vusi, if people want to find your project or anything, if they're listening or, to this, is there like just a quick website or something that they can go to learn more about your projects and what you're doing?
Yeah. I founded magazine called Iliso Magazine, ILIOS Magazine. It's one of the easiest ways to sort of get access to my work. But beyond that, I think I have a consistent social media presence, I guess. Vusumzi, and Instagram. Yeah. Okay. But really, in the Foucault sense, I'm less important here. The work is.
Okay.
So Iliso Magazine would be the most important that I'd like people to check out.
Okay, great.
Okay. Yeah.
And I will just say, I'm working on a nonprofit called Breath and Body Alive that is digging for the preciousness of Black breath.
Oh.
Yes, definitely.
Wow. Okay, that's amazing.
Yeah. So, To be continued.
Yes, definitely. All right, so I'm going to let everyone get on with their day, or in your case, Vusi, your evening.
Yeah.
I want to just once again just reiterate to both of you how appreciative I am of your thoughts and conversations and just pushing me. You've really opened up even new ways for me to think about the book that I wasn't thinking about it. And I think that's the goal of, like, you know, criticism and dialogue. So I do really appreciate it. I'm only saddened that this forum couldn't have actually been attended by, like, you know, 60 folks or whatever, but hopefully, but hopefully we'll get it out there. And thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I'm humbled, by your thoughts and by your engagement. Obviously, Tyler and I already have a pre-existing relationship. We'll definitely stay in touch, but definitely let's continue to dialogue. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. And for those of you watching, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.